what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Thanks everybody for coming. Packed house as we can all see. But it means a lot to have some people just here listening to what I want to talk about, which is this new book that I just published very recently called Deconstructing Settler-Socialism, Anarchism, and the Internationals in the Wild West. Long, classic mouthful of a history book title. But before getting in totally to just talk about the book itself, like the contents of the book, I just wanted to talk about like the book itself and the physical making of it, just because like if you kind of look at the very cover page right here, it says it's like, well, DIY'd on occupied Duwamish land. And that's because this is like, I didn't just write the book, but we like literally printed and bound and glued and trimmed the book as well, like in an apartment. Our little crew, Historical Sedition, started as a zine distro, originally just kind of like stealing work printing and whatever other printing we could possibly find. Eventually, we kind of outgrew that to the point where we needed to get our own copy machine. And I've been kind of working on this book project for a long time, but the idea to really start making our own books was kind of like when Little Black Cart, the publisher, stopped printing a couple of years back. They uploaded like a lot of their files online along with like kind of guides to how to do book binding, because they wanted to keep a lot of their titles in print even if they couldn't do it anymore. And so we took some of their advice. There's a couple things where we kind of cheaped out just because of the resources that we had. The first one we did were like literally just like, we're going to make some desert from their files. And we were literally like cutting 10 sheets of paper at a time and like taking cookie sheets to like hold things together and like gluing them by hand. And it was a whole process, but eventually we kind of were able to save up and get some very, very, very basic like equipment. It's still a little kind of rough around the edges. Sometimes you might notice like some of the trimming cuts are a little bit off sometimes, but it's just cool to be able to be like, well, we're anarchists and we want to be able to kind of do this stuff ourselves and bring these resources to our friends and also use it in ways to like support other people in our community. So it's just cool I want to talk about that. And if anyone has like questions about like how to make books and things like that, feel free to ask those as well. The talk itself is, I'm just going to kind of talk for like right about an hour. It's kind of a mix of like reading from this sheet, just kind of like passages straight from the book, as well as like just kind of some summaries and discussions of some of like the kind of major themes that I explore in the book. And then afterwards, kind of just in time for Q&A, hopefully it can kind of also be discussion, like if other people want to contribute or respond to something someone's asking or saying, like that's awesome. And also just before I get started, me and my homie Phoenix kind of fucked up on some of our planning, and we were originally thinking we were going to be able to catch like a late ferry from here to Victoria or Vancouver, and we realized that we have somewhere to stay, but we realized that is not going to happen. So if someone has like a couch or a floor or even somewhere we can park our car tonight, just let me know maybe afterwards. And okay, fuck yeah. Well, sweet. That's already done. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, we kind of I don't know. This is my first ever book tour, so the logistics are a little rough around the edges, but I guess I will go ahead and get started if you want to go to a new slide. November 3rd, 1885, Tacoma, Washington Territory, swindled Puyallup land. The steam whistle at Lister's Tacoma Ironworks blasted through the driving rain at precisely 9:30 a.m. Whistles from other factories soon added to the harsh chorus. Their wails normally signaled the start of a day's work. This Tuesday morning was different. Hundreds of white men and women assembled on Pacific Street, right here. The crowd marched from their meeting spot, advancing systematically through the city along a pre-planned route. Some of their bitter opponents later proclaimed them a rather orderly mob, orderly meaning well-organized. Despite countless paradoxical proclamations to the contrary, this crowd was not here to keep the peace. Their intent had always been understood implicitly and was also loudly proclaimed. Months of preparation were finalized the night prior by the Committee of Nine. This small collection of socialist and anarchist radicals was affiliated with a mysterious group called the International Workmen's Association. They assigned one another responsibility to spread the words through their networks. Overnight, they canvassed the white residents of designated neighborhoods. The tragic culmination of months of agitation, organization, and escalation was at hand. Soon after its start, this orderly yet ruthless crowd was joined by an old radical German immigrant, Tacoma's shopkeeper mayor Jacob Weissbach. Weissbach sometimes boasted that he had sheltered famous revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini after his flight from Italy following the upheavals of 1848. He professed sympathy with the anarchist peer Joseph Proudhon and claimed that repression resulting from all these associations might have forced his earlier departure from Europe. The mayor always proclaimed himself an advocate for the oppressed classes he considered to be the real producers within society. Weissbach oversaw the proceedings alongside the sheriff and the judge. In the minds of all these strange band of revolutionaries, the horrific acts to follow were the start of a new era. Weissbach's proclaimed goal of a harmonious society necessitated atrocity. His vision for a producer's republic on this newly stolen land was nauseatingly sterile white. On this dreadful day, it seemed one step closer to reality. The crowd passed each and every building home to the city's hundreds of Chinese residents, and at each designated building, they busted indoors. Every Chinese person inside was informed that the people commanded them out of the city. Men in the crowd beat several of their victims. Those who hesitated were dragged out. All understood the threat implied by the Winchester rifles and revolvers carried by many in the crowd. Some of the crowd even commandeered a boat to invade Kwok Su's waterfront building. He recalled them taking a great many of my goods and carried them into the boat. They also put me out of the house. The wind was blowing a gale. It was raining hard. Some of the Chinese lost their trunks, some their blankets. Many were crying. One Chinese resident managed to telegram the governor pleading for previously promised protection. None came. 200 people were rounded up. Hundreds more had already left in the weeks prior, fearing this very fate. Laborers, merchants, servants, and spouses were forced on foot in a handful of wagons to Lakeview Station, miles south of town by 3 p.m. Armed white men, many on horseback, escorted, supposedly, as they put it, the newly minted refugees. 2 Chinese men died of exposure waiting for the train to Portland the next day. Many couldn't afford the fare and walked over 100 miles to that Oregon city. When they arrived in Portland or some other refuge, it was their own Chinese immigrant community that took care of them during the arduous months and years to come. A sweeping wave of related catastrophes swept hundreds of towns and cities in the surrounding months. Tacoma's 1885 anti-Chinese pogrom was no isolated horror. For decades prior and decades to come, anti-Chinese violence was a bedrock of the white settler labor movement in so-called Western North America. White supremacy was a casting mold for labor unions of hard rock miners, railroad workers, and urban tradespeople. Stories from this era of the labor movement still circulate widely, praising the militancy of old unions like the Knights of Labor and the Western Federation of Miners. For white labor history nerds, the 1880s is a sort of mythical heroic age. Yet an uncomfortable truth lies buried under fables of armed workers confronting exploitive robber barons and state militias. The construction of the white supremacist settler-colonial empire that is the United States, and now that Canada, was not merely a top-down affair. We who envision and fight for another world must struggle with how idols of the past, figures and movements we may be inclined to identify with at first glance, help construct the very nightmare we seek to wake from today. The early history of anarchic ideas that set my mind ablaze once felt remote. It can be hard to intimately relate with endlessly retold stories of 19th century Eurobeards as an anarchist who's lived her entire life west of the Mississippi River. Parisian barricades, London exile committees, Spanish revolutionary unions, and Russian nihilist assassins all make for fascinating reading, but they're rather far from home. In most general histories of radical movements covering this early period, the region popularly remembered as the Wild West is entirely absent. At best, it's a deeply peripheral subject necessitating deliberate search for rare scraps of information. Digging ever deeper into the story of my home, I've come to realize the danger posed by this omission when contemplating radical history. During the 19th century, these lands were violently transformed from the sovereign domain of dozens of indigenous peoples into Western North America via a genocidal process of settler-colonialism. Much as I might hope otherwise, right radicals played a tragically intimate role in this process from the jump. The histories of anarchism, communism, socialism, feminism, syndicalism all have long roots in these lands, but those who tilled the soil were far from spotless heroes. You can go to the next slide. No organization is more frequently associated with the origins of these intertwined ideas than the International Workingmen's Association. The International, as it was called, facilitated an uneasy union between a broad spectrum of anti-capitalist movements in the 1860s and 70s, originally centered in Europe. It's often called the First International in light of innumerable later bodies claiming to revive its legacy of uniting militant working class organizations across national borders. Generations of Marxists have their second, third, and countless fourth internationals. Many anarchists carried on a decades-long tradition of considering their own transnational bodies mere continuations and reconstitutions of the original London-founded organization. Some still called for a renewed Black International. The International Workingmen's Association did not invent anarchism, communism, or social democracy. All of these were circulating and developing among radical workers and intellectuals in Europe and settler colonies for decades prior to its founding. And just as, if not more importantly, profound and often unrecognized influences originated in lifeways and ideologies cultivated by people suffering under colonial yoke. The International Workingmen's Association nevertheless played a decisive role in popularizing and differentiating various radical ideologies rooted in European and, by extension, settler American contexts. Its members laid key organizational foundations for broader movements to come. The International was formally established in 1864, the meeting depicted here. It and varying declared successors in the immediate following decade are the primary focus of both this talk and this book. Most books and essays on the International Workingmen's Association focus on its European activities, but the International was not an exclusively European body. The various radical networks it grew from spanned oceans from the onset, and the furthest flung major hub was San Francisco, though this has only been mentioned in a handful of pages worth of previously published research. This rapidly growing frontier metropolis was established on land seized by the United States a mere 2 decades before it was the site of the chartering of the first formal local section of the International on the continent in 1869. Despite a slow start abetted by San Francisco's then relatively remote location, the International laid deep roots in the city's radical milieu. And by the 1880s, San Francisco hosted its own homegrown revival of the International, known as the International Workmen's Association rather than Working Men's. Early internationalists drew up a blueprint for a budding region-wide militant labor movement spread from Denver to Vancouver. We often look to history as a source of inspiration. Well-known watchwords like agitate, educate, organize, and symbolism like the union-made label were pioneered by these Western radicals. But history can also serve as a warning and uncomfortable mirror for the present, forcing us to re-examine these practices in a new light. Many of these actions taken by these Wild West internationalists were outright atrocious and not merely when judged through a present-day lens. The very foundations of a regional fighting labor movement, still sometimes remembered and valorized today, was a widespread wave of racist anti-Chinese violence, cultivated by decades of white union, feminist, and socialistic agitators. Many of these same people and others they viewed as comrades fought long and hard to directly claim land for their own advancement by participating in the active genocidal theft of land from its original inhabitants. Collective colonization became a pillar of their radical practice. We cannot separate these radicals and their movements from the violent settler-colonial transformation occurring in their midst. Without, many played an enthusiastic and active role, at times facing righteous opposition from within and without. Colonial complicity held dire consequences for the global liberatory potential of their movements, and the lands on which they organized were already soaked with blood. More would have to be shed to transform vast swaths of a continent from the sovereign territories of dozens of indigenous nations into America and Canada. As a firm believer in the necessity of intersectional resistance, I've had to reckon with the dark reality that a narrower exclusionary model of solidarity can sometimes be profoundly effective for attaining certain self-centered ends. European immigrants from a variety of backgrounds collaborated together in the creation of whiteness, ensuring material comfort to generations of their descendants. Pale-faced women articulated their own oppression through the lens of white supremacy, allying with white male counterparts in viewing Black or Asian men as the greatest threat to their own advancement in the system. A veneer of working-class unity could sometimes be achieved not by uniting all who toiled, but by narrowly defining who belonged within that class as only comprising so-called skilled laborers, while jealously guarding access to said labor along race, gender, and other lines. Material gains were delivered over the backs of those thrown under the bus. Let's return to the International Workingmen's Association, which emerged from the exile network of defeated revolutionaries during European-wide upheavals occurring in the years following 1848 and 49, but also through continuing cross-border exchanges between ongoing working class and radical democratic movements. Founded in London in September 1864, the International had ties in cities like Geneva and Paris from the very beginning and included delegates from other European countries at the start. It was intended to act as a coordinating body for labor movements across borders, preventing the working classes of one country from being pitted against those in others in military or in economic conflict. One influential early member was Karl Marx, who received a late invite to attend the founding convention and was nominated to serve on the committee writing the organization's statutes. Marx's draft was ultimately accepted as the organization's general rules, a sort of constitution, yet it was common for radicals of various cultural and ideological backgrounds to quite literally translate its contents into a language more acceptable to their specific sentiments. A line in Marx's English language draft implied that political and electoral action was a primary means to achieving the economic emancipation of the working class. French translations, including one formalized at the International's First General Congress in 1866, typically left out the phrase as a means, and in their phrasing implied that the political activity was entirely subordinate to other actions. Anarchistic elements often pointed to this translation to reject Marx's insistence on forming political parties. The General Rules Preamble declared that all societies and individuals adhering to it would base their conduct on truth, justice, and morality without regard to color, creed, or nationality. Yet Marx and many of his contemporaries had a narrow racist obsession with civilizational progress that narrowed the horizon and more or less became the General Rules definition of internationalism, that the emancipation of labor is neither local nor a national, but a social problem, embracing all countries in which modern society exists, and depending for its solution on the concurrence, practical and theoretical, of the most advanced countries. The qualifiers modern and most advanced were not arbitrary filler, but reflected Marx's particular view of the linear nature of progress. To him, the social problems faced by laboring classes in countries deemed less advanced were fundamentally different than workers in Europe or the United States, and there could be little to no meaningful basis for solidarity. This would later emerge as a point of conflict. Now, turning our eyes across the globe to San Francisco. As the metropolitan heart of the expanding U.S. empire's Pacific coast, San Francisco grew rapidly after its 1848 acquisition in the Mexican-American War, spurred by an unprecedented gold rush that resulted in a genocidal campaign of extermination targeting California's numerous indigenous peoples. In just 2 decades, San Francisco swelled from a backwater port on the land of the Ohlone people known as Yerba Buena to the U.S.'s 10th largest city with 150,000 inhabitants. At the end of the 1860s, it was also the terminus of the first transcontinental railroad. The rapid completion of the western half of this line would have been impossible without the blood and sweat of tens of thousands of Chinese immigrant workers. Chinese people had crossed the Pacific for centuries, including on colonial Spanish Manila galleons, but a massive wave arrived in North America with the gold rush. While early Chinese miners often worked on contract for wealthier Chinese merchants, many in fact formed small-scale egalitarian mining cooperatives, following practices first developed back in their home country and further continued in the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. These arrangements were very hardly recognized by white contemporaries who really only focused on the contract work for wealthy merchants. As the easiest gold deposits began to run dry by the 1860s, some miners turned to employment in emerging urban industries, while others took up railroad construction labor. Roughly a quarter of California's workforce during the 1860s and 70s were Chinese men. But white men enjoyed far more job prospects and opportunities to acquire stolen land of their own. The few white people who volunteered for the railroad were ultimately not displaced by Chinese workers, but rather upgraded to higher paying supervisory, technical, and supply roles. With limited other options, Chinese workers were often forced to accept lower pay, but that's absolutely not to imply that they were the submissive mass imagined by white contractors. Many fled job sites in order to escape abusive contracts and were often able to find other work. Several thousand Chinese workers threw down their tools on the railroad's line construction in June 24, 1867. They struck to demand shorter hours and equal pay with those few white workers that joined them on the hardest tasks. Railroad management blockaded their camp with the aid of Chinese merchants to cut off food and other supplies. Nevertheless, the strike lasted a full week before they were starved into submission. Perhaps 1,000 Chinese laborers would ultimately die by the time the line was complete in 1869. Many capitalists expected Chinese workers to accept lower wages than their white counterparts. And while these workers often took what they could get, they frequently demanded more. White trade unionists could have reached out a hand in solidarity, demanding equal wages for all. They refused, perceiving a racialized threat in increasing Chinese urban employment. Working class so-called anti-coolie clubs, like the association headed by General Wynn in San Francisco, were formed at this time as vehicles for fighting a racist war over the shop floor. The myth that Chinese immigrant laborers were imported under a quasi-slave regime had pernicious staying power in white labor circles, and the abolition of slavery post-Civil War heightened its rhetorical significance. Its limited basis in reality as regarding the West Coast was that a minority of emigres leaving China were indeed bound by indenture contracts, but these workers did not travel to North America, but rather Cuba or other plantations in the Caribbean, as well as Peruvian guano mining islands. These heavily exploited workers came from the poorest spheres of Chinese society and often lacked any sorts of family support systems back home. The vast majority of Chinese immigrants to California, as well as BC on the other hand, came from many of the same backgrounds as the European and American counterparts. Back home, they were farmers, artisans, mechanics, and merchants, often with existing resources. Some paid their own passage outright. Families sometimes pooled resources to send one or two members over. Others utilized the so-called credit ticket system, borrowing money from their passage from clan or district associations or from merchants in China. They were expected to pay back these loans with interest, but they were able to change jobs oftentimes. And where's that? And even as getting crushed in a cycle of wage labor isn't the ideal situation either. The reality is that the Chinese people arriving in San Francisco were attempting to exercise resources and agency in seeking fortune on this stolen land as their European and white Euro-American counterparts that possessed the necessary resources to travel to the far distant West. The dependency on powerful Chinese merchants that Euro-Americans frequently lambasted was something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As working-class Chinese faced increasing rejection from the wider society, merchant-run native place associations provided essential support and resources. Twin faces of solidarity and control helped entrench the communal power of wealthy merchants, while laborers were increasingly instrumentalized to serve broader colonial goals, a trend certainly not limited to their ethnic enclave, and one that many individuals found ways to escape. You can go to the next slide. Many radical European exiles carried early conceptions of internationalism with them when they first arrived in San Francisco. But this didn't manifest in a section of the International Workingmen's Association until 1869, when one was formed by a group of German immigrants. This did not initially involve direct communication with the International's General Council in London, but rather with organizers in Geneva, Switzerland, which at the time was a major hub for a nascent group called the Group of German Language Sections. Several of the early members of the International were exiles of the defeated 1848 revolutions in Europe who forged connections with old comrades from those struggles. Many of these, like Philip Reiter, kind of in the middle of the picture with the hat, looking at the camera. Not the camera, but the painter, I guess you could say. Pictured there when he's kind of imprisoned after that revolution fell apart. Many, like Philip Reiter, were initially more interested in what they viewed as the international support for freedom struggles back home. But they soon came to believe that their section in San Francisco needed to forge local ties with what they called Native American workers, that is, white Americans, who were hardly more native to recently conquered San Francisco than they themselves, or for that matter, the Chinese workers who built the railroad that brought many of them over. Their early efforts concentrated on reaching out to the Mechanics State Council, which was a loose unifying body for San Francisco's early white trades unions, with connections in other cities. Philip Reiter believed that they could awaken a socialist consciousness within this body, perhaps even convince it to affiliate with the International. But this does not mean opposing the Council's rabid anti-Chinese organizing. The Council had intimate ties with the earlier mentioned parallel network of anti-coolie clubs dedicated to driving Chinese workers out of industries and the land entirely. Philip Reiter, in fact, thought that white workers facing need and hunger through competition from the Chinese would view our social aspirations less haughtily and join together as supporters, as he put it in a letter. This would set an ominous pattern for the activities of many later West Coast internationalists. At the same time, the German section briefly pursued an attempt to establish a cooperative colony on recently stolen federal lands, utilizing the provisions of the U.S. Homestead Act. While their efforts proved fruitless, the attempts of later internationalists went further down this line. While this early German section was organizing, exiled French radicals in San Francisco were forming networks of their own. Amid a war between France and the German states in 1870 to 71, shared opposition to the war formed the basis for connections between French and German internationalists largely outnumbered within their own communities. The result was a local French section of the International Workingmen's Association, which soon began publishing its own paper entitled L'Internationale. This was soon followed by a so-called American section that ran meetings in English. Like the German section, both the French and American sections initially took up significant opposition to Chinese workers. At the American section's founding, the chair stated that one object of the internationals was to prevent operators of one country being crushed by the importation of cheap labor from another. But they recognized in full the principle that it was the first duty of every man to protect himself, and that so long as Chinese or other labor had a tendency to degrade rather than elevate labor, so long would the association legitimately be arraigned against it. Many of the early members of the American section were spiritualists, part of a radically decentralized, proto-feminist dissident religious movement that grew out of old abolitionist circles and believed in the personal ability to commune with spirits beyond the pale of the afterlife. These days, spiritualists are most known for being the innovators of seances and mediums. The first opposition to the local international's blatant white supremacist stance would, in fact, come from within this milieu. Go to the next slide. By 1872, a number of conflicts within the International Workingmen's Association caused a series of splits in the organization. Most famously, a controversial General Congress in The Hague expelled anarchists James Guillaume and Mikhail Bakunin, only to have the majority of European members and the largest national federations depart with them, most notably those of Spain and Italy. At the same time, the International in the United States splintered, with rival factions aligning themselves with those in Europe, even as the terms of disagreement were sometimes reversed. For instance, in the American Marxist-aligned faction, uh, they agreed with their European counterparts on the need for organizational centralization. But while Marx and his European associates privileged political and parliamentary agitation, their American allies largely rejected electoralism in favor of a narrow focus on trade union organizing. Meanwhile, the European Federalist wing, often known as the Euro Federation for its base in the Euro Valley of Switzerland, found common cause with many American sections who upheld local section autonomy. But while the majority of the European Eurogroup outright rejected political action in favor of combining workplace organizing and insurrectionary action as stepping stones to revolution, the general trend within the American Federalist wing inclined to radical democratizing political movements seeking Black and women's suffrage, though they were also involved in union and unemployed struggles. Most analyses of the split in the International have focused on both personal grudges as well as these broad ideological debates around organizational centralization versus federation, political versus workplace activity, and national versus transnational internal structures. One less commented on, but no less important debate held tremendous import for the future scope of internationalism itself. Founded in Europe and with only a handful of non-white members, the International was a long way from representing the global working class as described in its statutes without regard to color, creed, or nationality. San Francisco's sections had already broken with this ideal. They locally established what was, in effect, a white-only multilingual coalition, vocally refusing to accept Chinese workers for membership. In so doing, the San Franciscans excluded them from their vision of the working class. This could not remain a California matter. The Chinese question, as they called it, was debated across oceans within the International and became a significant, if rarely noticed, factor in the organization's split. Support or opposition to attempts by white settler workers in California to exclude their Chinese counterparts did not merely follow, but sometimes shaped the battle lines of centralizers and federalists. The crux of this debate still carries weight for radicals today. Must revolution be approached intersectionally, or can a narrow view of class set aside questions of race, of gender, of coloniality, and more for supposedly after the revolution? In July 1872, as the faction fight was heating up, some members of the International's General Council proposed striking the words modern society and advanced countries from the earlier mentioned section of the general rules that talked about how capitalism was a social problem, embracing all countries in which modern society exists, and depended for its solution on the concurrence of the most advanced countries. This proposal hoped to embrace the people of all countries. One supporter, in fact, argued that modern society itself was the enemy. It had accumulated capital and machinery in the hands of a class and made the mass of the people wage slaves, rendering the International necessary. But ultimately, this proposal was voted down. Friedrich Engels argued bitterly from a perspective of distinct phases of civilization, claiming that it was absurd to imagine that the slaves of Cuba and Brazil, or the population of China and India, could at once be developed into associative laborers. They must first be made free laborers before they could be emancipated. To take out the words modern society would be to take out the pith. At the same time, European federalists were arguing that it was entirely possible to advance from what might be characterized as feudalism and slavery to freedom without necessarily passing through industrial capitalism. Mikhail Bakunin, in The Political Theology of Mazzini and the International, argued, albeit in a paternalistic fashion, that Chinese workers in California were serving an apprenticeship in liberty, dignity, rights, and human respect. He insisted that it was not enough that Europe and America should emancipate themselves and form a grand federative republic founded on emancipated and solidary labor. For any revolution against all authority to be secure, it must be, as he said, triumphant in Africa and especially in Asia. And California's workers reaching out a hand in solidarity was perhaps the only way by which revolution might be carried back across the Pacific. The anarchist geographer Élisée Reclus took this argument even further, insisting that white workers needed to unite with Chinese workers in order to claim in common the full product of their labor. As the global power of capital increased and consolidated, it could only be matched by an equally internationally minded working class. Reclus was informed by extensive study of global history and geography, And in an article published in the Eurofederation's bulletin, Reclus laid out the extensive history of Chinese toilers fighting back against oppression. European workers' associations and cooperatives, in Reclus' words, find their masters and predecessors in China, while in our parts of Western Europe, workers' associations are still the exception. They have been the uniform rule for centuries in the Far East. The arguments made by Reclus and Bakunin were shared by their Federalist counterparts across the Atlantic. Victoria Woodhull, a prominent spiritualist associated with the International in New York, denounced U.S. senators who voted to deny Chinese immigrant citizenship as dancing the Jim Crow. Meanwhile, their Marxian-aligned rivals, led by a Hoboken, New Jersey-based man named Friedrich Zorga, passed a resolution decreeing that the members of the International Association of the United States are required to support the anti-Chinese political and social movement and to join it even if they see no chance of success. One article in the French section's organ L'International declared that the International Association proclaims human solidarity and wishes to apply it immediately as far as the situation allows. It is ready to admit in its bosom any member without distinction of sex, color, or nationality. But, as a natural consequence of the above-mentioned principle, it demands reciprocity. Therefore, from the day when a Chinese man knocks at its door with the formal intention of regulating his conduct according to the said principles, he will be welcome. As for the others, if they do not want to submit to them, if they cannot mutually contribute with us to our progress and to our emancipation, if by coming to us they become the instruments with which the capitalists can most surely fight and destroy our tendencies to tear us from their clutches, we say to them, withdraw, you are not one of us. In this and many other proclamations, Chinese people were blamed for white people's desire to exclude them from the United States and the International Workingmen's Association. A theoretical door was left open for future Chinese membership in a painful attempt not to contradict the organization's ostensible founding principles. But after ranting for a couple thousand words about Chinese workers' supposed servile nature and economic threat, the author clearly did not expect the opening to be utilized. The formed support of Friedrich Zorga and Marx and his allies for Chinese exclusion ultimately won the loyalty of all three of San Francisco's sections, German, French, and American. While most German sections in the United States ultimately aligned with Zorga's faction, the French sections were quite divided in their loyalties, and San Francisco's American section was notably the only one of the American sections in the country to align itself with Zorga from the very start of the split. As the 1870s rolled on, there actually emerged a tragically failed attempt from within San Francisco to challenge the local xenophobic consensus. You can go to the next slide. Some of the San Francisco American section, like Laurel Cuppy Kendrick of its spiritualist wing, began to question exclusion. Much of the limited available discourse within the city's international during the mid-1870s can be found in the local radical spiritualist paper Common Sense. Kendrick and other local internationalists, including Pat J. Healy, began arguing in favor of equal rights for all, the Chinese included. One Chinese slipper maker, Ahi Lee, this being one of his articles, even wrote into Common Sense to insist that he was in favor of the rest of Common Sense's radical material, but asserted bluntly that Chinese people did not deserve the blame that some authors in the paper ascribed them for the societal ills that the paper campaigned against. Common Sense was edited by the radical Slocum couple, William and Amanda. In an editorial reply to Ahi Lee, one of the Slocums indicated that they were somewhat skeptical of his arguments, but granted that it remains an open question whether or not it would be better for our own people to discourage the importation and employment of Chinese. Yet Ahi Lee seems to have been the only Chinese person that these local internationalists actually connected with. Their approach still seemed to be largely let them come to us, at best. When it came to hot-button issues, these local internationalists preferred to avoid the question of race entirely rather than confront it head-on. This weak position would soon have tragic consequences and make the first attempt to challenge xenophobia in the Pacific Coast labor movement rather short-lived. The Marxian wing of the International was soon largely defunct in Europe and survived in a diminished state in the US until 1876, when it merged with several other socialist groups to form the Working Men's Party of the United States. The American Federalist wing of the International had already faded from the scene, though many of its participants would remain involved in radical struggles, but it lasted longer in Europe and soon gave birth to an organized anarchist movement. Go to the next slide. Yeah, that one. She can go to the next slide real quick. I'm going to have you come back to that one. In 1877, the United States was rocked by a colossal railroad strike. Amid a depression, bosses sought to impose yet another in a series of drastic wage cuts. Workers across the East Coast and mid the Midwest rose up spontaneously and battled state militias and even federal troops in one of the largest labor uprisings in U.S. history. California's railroad barons had been planning their own cuts, but preemptively dropped their proposal after witnessing this resistance elsewhere. In San Francisco, members of the new Working Men's Party of the United States thus called for a solidarity meeting with the strikers to the east on July 23, 1877. In California, Chinese workers were intimately associated with railroad construction and maintenance work. Many among the 10,000 attendees of the rally at the empty sandlot in front of City Hall were thus certainly eagerly anticipating racist denunciations of Chinese labor. Those who spoke on the platform, including Laura Cuppy Kendrick, instead insisted that this was not an anti-Chinese meeting, merely an act of labor solidarity with the strikers in the East. Many in the crowd were not pleased. And in fact, organized anti-coolie clubs erected their own opposing stage platform on the sandlot and drew in a large part of the crowd. Many of them soon set off on a failed attempt to burn down Chinatown and the Pacific Mail Steamship Company's docks, sparking days of rioting throughout the city. Go back a slide. Can I get a little hand raise for who's seen this picture before? In some form, maybe in a meme. Instead of saying "We gay do crime" or "up against the wall, motherfuckers," this is the original version of this little anarchy skeleton right here. An 1880 political cartoon by Thomas Nast. If you'll notice, it kind of says at the very top of it, talking about the new Constitution of California, and below mentioning this thing called Kearneyism. And go back to the other slide we were just on. A man named Dennis Kearney, right here, emerged from the rubble of the 1877 riots. With a handful of friends, he formed a rival Working Men's Party of California, the name clearly a jab at the Working Men's Party of the United States that had recently rejected him for membership. Its slogan was, "The Chinese must go." The Working Men's Party of California soon became the first mass labor party in the state. Many former internationalists and Working Men's Party of the U.S. members quickly joined, including William Slocum, much of the old Germans, as well as much of the old German section. Within the party, distinct wings quickly emerged. There was a relative consensus around xenophobia more generally, with all willing to uphold the party's racist slogan. But while Kearney long insisted that it be the only plank, others, including ex-internationalists like Slocum, viewed xenophobia as merely a step in the road to a deeper transformation in labor and society. Many in the latter group came to oppose what they saw as Kearney's dictatorial rule of the party. And from this group, there emerged a trades assembly uniting a number of trade unions, a form of organization that Kearney himself opposed. Kearney's wing, though, was far larger for several years and managed to elect numerous officials, including mayors in San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, and many other cities, as well as a large number of state legislators. They also played a key role in an 1878 convention that redrafted California's constitution, including inserting a handful of explicit anti-Chinese clauses. Dennis Kearney's Working Men's Party faded by the early 1880s, though it lingered on a husk of itself for most of the rest of the decade. Part of this was due to additional factional rivalries. Part lay at the feet of a series of corruption scandals by the party's elected officials. But perhaps most importantly was the fact that it had more or less won its demand. Chinese exclusion became a broad sweeping political consensus, not just in California, not just throughout much of the West, but throughout much of the United States, accepted by both of the older parties, undermining the Working Men's Party's singular plank. And all of this ultimately helped drive the 1882 Chinese Restriction Act, the first in U.S. history explicitly banning immigration on the basis of race. Now, if you go to the next slide. In the 1880s, the concept of the international was revived. One relatively well-known group is the anarchistic International Working People's Association that grew out of an 1881 Socialist Revolutionaries Conference in London, organized by many former members of the old Euro Federation, as with associates in the United States, Mexico, and the Middle East. The Federalists, this international, the IWPA, is best remembered for its association with the 1886 Haymarket Affair that is commemorated every year on May Day. Haymarket martyrs, including Albert Parsons and August Spies, were members of the IWPA. Yet at the same time that the IWPA was getting off the ground, a parallel international, that's these guys, was emerging on the Pacific coast in San Francisco. This group, known as the International Workmen's Association, was launched in 1882 out of a study group associated with the Trades Assembly formed by the anti-Kearney wing of the old Working Men's Party of California. The idea for reviving the old international apparently came from correspondence with Henry Hinman, a London-based socialist whose Democratic Federation included members of Karl Marx's small inner circle, including his daughter Eleanor and several sons-in-law, as well as other notable socialists and even anarchists at the time like William Morris. Marx himself was on his deathbed at the time. Several early members of this new International Workmen's Association, which I'll refer to as the IWA and hopefully not get that mixed up with the IWPA, maintained long-standing socialist and international commitments. One founding executive member of this San Francisco group was John Redstone, who was in London when the First International was founded and maintained tangential involvement before immigrating to the United States. Andrew Starkweather wrote a key introduction to socialism for the group and had been a long-standing socialist in San Francisco and carried banners announcing the 1877 Solidarity Rally with railroad strikers. William Slocum, the old co-publisher of Common Sense, who had joined the First International in its later years and later the Working Men's Party, became a prominent member of the new IWA in Sacramento and later Eureka, California. The most notorious figure associated with this newly revived international was a former lawyer named Burnett Haskell with the little mustache up there. With the invaluable assistance of his wife, Anna, Burnett published a radical newspaper called Truth that became the first organ of the new IWA. And the drawing up there is Anna. It's kind of the best image I was able to find of her. Burnett initially articulated a vision of the IWA that called for a reunion of red and black, that is, Marxists and anarchists. And early on, he preached the new radical gospel of dynamite alongside radical trade unionism while denouncing electoral activity. During this period, Truth even published perhaps the first English translations of notable essays by Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, Gotham the State Ends to the Young, or Appeal to the Young. When the soon-to-be frenemies in the IWPA were organizing, Haskell initially reached out with proposals to merge their respective organizations. Some of Burnett Haskell's rhetorical flourishes were in fact incorporated into the well-known IWPA manifesto, the Pittsburgh Proclamation, named after the city where the organization largely formalized itself in 1883. But Haskell's organizational ideas were rejected by the delegates in Pittsburgh as confused and authoritarian. The two organizations would revive the question of merging at various times, though no formal union ever fully took shape. Over time, Haskell and others in the IWA, the San Francisco-based group, began to refer to themselves as the Socialist Red International to contrast with the growing overt anarchism of the Black International of the IWPA. Though in a rather paradoxical fashion, Haskell sometimes also referred to his group as the only American international, opposed to the anarchists' foreign international. While the anarchist IWPA built a formidable base across the Midwest and East Coast, and even in the southern United States, the San Francisco-based group spread its wings across the West. Many California towns and cities had IWA group, and while some of them were short-lived, others lasted for years. Denver, in Colorado, emerged as a major hub for the group. A leading organizer there was Joseph Buchanan, a typographer who soon ran a popular paper called the Labor Inquirer that was distributed throughout the Rocky Mountains. Buchanan became a major figure in the Knights of Labor, the largest labor union at the time, after he helped organize the powerful body of Union Pacific Railroad workers. The furthest eastern hub of the IWA lay in Topeka, Kansas. The IWA welcomed many white European immigrants into its fold and had significant pull, especially among German immigrants. Yet it upheld the despicable local tradition in the West Coast labor movement of virulent xenophobia. Truth and the Labor Inquirer often published vile racist articles on the subject. The group's active embrace of xenophobia as an organizing strategy came to its head in 1885. You can go to the next slide. Eureka, California, was one of the city's main California hubs. It's primarily a lumber town. When local logging and mill companies sought to hire Chinese workers, the local Knights of Labor, which was heavily influenced by IWA members who served as officers, began a sustained anti-Chinese agitation campaign. After a local city councilman was accidentally killed in the crossfire of a gunfight between rival Chinese secret society groups, the racists saw their chance to strike. A mass meeting of white citizens formed a committee of 9 tasked with delivering the message to the Chinese community that they would all need to leave Eureka immediately. A noose was hung outside Chinatown to bring the message home. The success of this expulsion kicked off a wave of similar expulsions across Western North America. 2 men who were present in Eureka helped spread it to the Pacific Northwest within several months. William Christie, a carpenter and Tacoma School Board member, would soon join the IWA and help spark the wave of agitation that culminated in the expulsion of Tacoma's Chinese community that started this talk. Daniel Cronin, already an IWA and Knights organizer, traveled to the Pacific Northwest soon after Christie, where he chartered Knights locals from Seattle to Portland and many small towns in European, while more covertly organizing for the International. In most of these places, local white settlers took up Chinese expulsion as a platform on which to build their labor movement, though many brought other agendas to the table as well. After November 1885, when the Tacoma's Chinatown was expelled, the U.S. Army declared martial law. But when they left the Sailor Sea a few months later, Knights and Internationalists in Seattle attempted their own expulsion. It's depicted up here on the slide. After the dust settled amid gun battles between expulsionists and a law and order faction overseen by the local sheriff, only a couple dozen of Seattle's hundreds of Chinese residents remained. The next year, the Knights of Labor in Vancouver, BC, attempted their own expulsion. An IWA organizer present in Eureka had also traveled there after the Eureka incident. After a fire burned most of the booming young railroad metropolis of Vancouver, many white residents held street meetings surrounded by rubble. They passed resolutions seeking to ban Chinese people from reestablishing themselves during rebuilding. The mayor and other local politicians professed support for the idea, but nothing came of it. Officials claimed they were limited by their legal power, that their capacity to act was hamstrung by a Victorian-based provisional government dominated by railroad and mining interests. The Knights of Labor stepped into the void, organizing mass meetings and declaring the expulsion of the city's Chinese resident supposed to happen in January of 1887. On January 7th, and again on February 24th, 1887, crowds of hundreds of white people descended on the Brick House estate on Vancouver's West End, where they beat and drove away Chinese work crews engaged in forest clearance. On the latter occasion, Chinatown itself was also raided, while Chinese fishermen on False Creek were also violently expelled. Eventually, the provincial government of Victoria imposed direct control over Vancouver's local government. An armed force deployed to secure Chinese residents' return. The only unrest for some time was a brief strike by the Chinese themselves against a shortage of camp cooks and the high prices charged by the contractors for provisions and other supplies. There would be no more major attempt to drive the Chinese from Vancouver during these decades. Historian Beth Lou Williams has counted at least 160 attempted or successful expulsions across the West just in the years between 1885 and 1887. One of the deadliest of these was the September 1885 massacre in the Union Pacific coal town of Rock Springs, Wyoming, where at least 30 Chinese residents were murdered in an outrage perpetrated by the local Knights of Labor, who maintained ties with organizers in Denver like Joseph Buchanan. While not every one of the expulsions during this period known as the driving out were directly the work of the IWA, it played a key role in fanning the flames and helping to engineer some of the most visible tragedies. One of the few IWA members to speak out was the barber and former sailor Sigismund Danielovich. At a San Francisco convention in December 1885, aiming to organize a coast-wide labor federation, the hottest topic on the agenda was the ongoing anti-Chinese drive. Danielovich, who played a key role in organizing a formidable IWA-affiliated Coast Sailors Union, hoped to argue against socialists identifying themselves with the anti-Chinese movements. Yet he was laughed off the stage, with no support from his fellow internationalists. Danielovich would leave the IWA soon afterward. As the driving out campaign was heating up, the IWA was once again engaging in talks with their rival anarchist IWPA regarding a potential organizational merger. The IWA's xenophobic drive ended up being a factor in the failure of this merger, with some IWPA members firmly denouncing their counterparts' racist involvement and insisting that the International had to embrace all workers of the world, including Chinese laborers. Yet it must be noted that the IWPA stance was not especially firm. Some IWPA members defended their IWA counterparts. Albert Parsons himself was rather ambiguous on the matter. While never outright publishing denunciations of Chinese workers in his Chicago anarchist paper, The Alarm, he sometimes took punchy quotes from West Coast papers, from articles in West Coast papers that were filled with xenophobia and simply took the punchy quotes out of context to help fill column space. In April 1886, Parsons announced in The Alarm that he had been invited by the Comrades of San Francisco to visit the West Coast and hoped to conduct a speaking tour in Sacramento, Portland, Tacoma, Seattle, and elsewhere. Would Albert Parsons have denounced the racist entanglements of his West Coast counterparts? Would he have embraced them, given that 7 years before, when he was not yet an anarchist, he had in fact shared a stage with Dennis Kearney during one of Kearney's own tours to the Midwest? Or would he have tried to stay silent on the matter in front of a West Coast audience, avoid the topic entirely? We will never know. Mere weeks after making that announcement, dynamite flew in Chicago's Haymarket Square amid the historic May Day strike. Parsons was jailed and would soon hang. Let's see, can I have you go to the next slide? Get point three. Xenophobia was tragically not the only problematic entanglement of West Coast settler radicals. From the early days of the United States and Canada, a distinct settler colonial current can be traced that combined visions of genocidal manifest destiny with utopian visions of a new society for settlers themselves. From the Puritans who sought to create a city on a hill to later millenarian Christian communism and utopian socialism, the frontier was often advanced by those paradoxically seeking to escape from capitalist civilization, only to ultimately implant it in new soil stolen from indigenous inhabitants. Over time, the active collective colonization became a conscious radical tactic, interchanging with labor organization, politics, insurrection. At times, and in some organizations, it combined with these tactics, while others turned to colonization as other methods seemed to fail, and vice versa. As the IWA's ongoing xenophobic pogroms ultimately failed to spark full-fledged social revolution, many participants shifted their eyes to utopian colony building. Burnett Haskell and many California IWA members founded the Cahuilla colony in the Sierra Nevada mountains, pictured right here in front of this enormous tree. That's Have any of y'all heard of this tree before that these days gets called General Sherman? It is the largest tree in the world by volume. They called it the Karl Marx tree. Um, uh, in the Northwest, many of the participants in Seattle and Tacoma's IWA and broader socialist movement helped found the Puget Sound Cooperative Colony that jump-started the nascent city of Port Angeles on the Olympic Peninsula, attracting some 500 residents at its peak and featuring a cooperative sawmill, a fleet of boats, library, theater, stores, and more. Others, including Daniel Cronin, formed a smaller colony in Oregon. Many other Western settler socialists, especially from Denver and Kansas, participated in a colonial venture in Sinaloa, Mexico, where they established a port at Topolobampo, with the aim of serving as the terminus of a cooperatively run railroad running from the U.S. Midwest down to Sinaloa's Pacific coast. Many of these and other cooperative colonial ventures were founded on land directly stolen from indigenous people. The Puget Sound colony, for instance, was established on a beach still utilized by local Clallam people as a seasonal stopover point for canoe journeys. These cooperative land projects thus served double duty as a garrison force for settler colonial land theft. While Cahuilla, Puget Sound, and Topolobampo each drew in hundreds of recruits, they ultimately failed in their grander vision of forming a model socialist utopia that would prove their ideas on a small scale and inspire broader social transformation. The specific reasons for failure vary greatly, ranging from state repression to gradual abandonment of socialist ideals in favor of individualized business and land speculation ventures. This latter fate led to the end of the colony at Port Angeles. The land itself was originally supposed to be available only to colony members. Amid a growing regional land rush, a so-called business element within the colony eyed unfolding opportunities for real estate speculation. And I might add that this land rush had been in part facilitated by the colony's growth itself. This element succeeded in opening up land sales to any interested parties as the decade wore on. By 1889, the old cooperative structure had largely fallen by the wayside, and a 4th of July picnic represented the last full meeting of colonists. Collective enterprises were leased out or sold off one by one. A small group of trustees managed it more or less like a flagging private business with stockholders. A lawsuit in 1890 sought to dissolve the colony, but its claimants did not carry it to conclusion. But further suits were filed in 1893. Legal receivership battles over the colony's extensive property holdings dragged on for many more years, only wrapping up in 1904. Yet the nightmarish dream of collective colonization did not die with them. In the short term, the Pacific Northwest became a target for further colonial ventures in the 1890s, as socialists across the United States sought to co-opt the speculative growth logic of manifest destiny for their own purpose. A number of colonies were founded in Washington state as part of an intentional program by socialists across the country to focus their efforts on one young state that they believed would inevitably grow exponentially. They imagined that they could establish themselves early on, and with a network of colonies serving as a nucleus, expand to a broader capture of state power. In the longer run, these colonies can be seen as part of a broader tradition that includes such ignominious institutions as labor Zionist kibbutz colonies in Palestine that helped establish a rank-and-file infrastructure for colonization. We must also consider how modern analogs to these 19th century efforts can be found in numerous radical communes and land projects formed from the 1960s up to the present. Just as older colony ventures lacked any meaningful indigenous ties and often nakedly expropriated land held from time immemorial, many latter-day projects uncritically continue to imagine their utopian community springing up from blank wilderness. The IWA ultimately faded rather quietly into the night by early 1888. But it left a complex legacy with a number of branching afterlives. Its most direct aftermath, aside from the cooperative colonies, was the blueprint it drew up for a powerful and independent-minded white Western labor movement. Many former IWA organizers took a prominent role in forming labor unions from San Francisco to the Salish Sea and into the Rocky Mountains. Many of these unions developed a reputation for militancy and direct action. But the horrific anti-Chinese actions of the 1880s must be figured as a tragic seminal example of this. Xenophobia infused many of these unions for decades to come and formed the template for often violent racist campaigns carried out against subsequent immigrants racialized as Asian from Japan, the Philippines, India, and elsewhere. Perhaps more optimistically, or you can go to the next slide, at least slightly more optimistically, we can look to the radical networks forged by Sigismund Danielewicz, the big long beard up there, after leaving the IWA over opposition to the anti-Chinese campaign. Within a few years, Danielewicz launched an anarchist paper called The Beacon that he later co-edited with Clara Dixon. The Beacon helped unite a scattered network of West Coast radicals who sympathized with Danielowicz's earlier stance and joined it with a broader network of anarchists across the continent who remained committed to attacking all authority in the aftermath of Haymarket. Correspondents to Danielowicz's paper later founded a Portland anarchist paper called The Firebrand, which served as a direct predecessor to the better-known San Francisco paper Free Society, whose own spiritual successor, when it was ultimately discontinued in 1904, was Emma Goldman's Mother Earth. Can have you go to the next slide. The anarchist movement increasingly took a militant anti-imperialist stance, denouncing U.S. invasions of Hawaii, the Philippines, and Cuba, while forming interracial anti-colonial alliances with global anarchist radicals. From the diasporic Sikh and Bengali Ghadar Party, formed on the North American Pacific coast with the aim of overthrowing the British Empire in India, as well as organizing immigrant laborers locally, to Japanese anarchists like Kotoko Shusue, who aimed to build a pan-Asian anti-colonial alliance while also organizing Japanese workers in North America, to the anarchistic rebels of the Partido Liberal Mexicano, like the Magon brothers, whose struggles took them across borders. One associate of the Firebrand and Free Society groups, the Slovenian immigrant Al Klemencic, was instrumental in embedding a genuinely internationalist vision into the industrial workers of the world. Klemencic originally lived in Tacoma after immigrating to the U.S., starting in 1893. He moved around to many places, including Hawaii and Colorado, and at other times lived back in Tacoma. When some delegates at the IWW's founding convention proposed naming the new union the Industrial Union of America, anarchist delegates passionately persuaded attendees to change America to the world. As Klemencic argued, albeit with some outdated language, we know we have got Austrians, Chinamen, Japs, and people of all nationalities here in this country, and so we have got Frenchmen, Germans, and Italians, and we are a cosmopolitan crew. All lines that were ever established have always been established by men who are a bunch of robbers, thieves, and exploiters, and we want to combine ourselves as humanity, as one lot of people, those that are producing the wealth of our oppressors, and we want to have under that banner our brothers and sisters of the world. Yet the anti-colonial framework of these settler anarchists must be seriously qualified with the fact that they frequently lacked a meaningful critique of American settler colonialism. White wobblies and anarchists might have envisioned wide-ranging societal changes and even opposed imperialism abroad, but amid their dreams of overthrowing capitalist power, working-class settler radicals positioned themselves as the rightful owners of the industrial leviathan consuming stolen land. There were certainly many indigenous wobblies and some early anarchists. Many organized jointly with the heavily indigenous Partido Liberal Mexicano, and others like Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh waterfront workers in Vancouver, British Columbia, focused on more local affairs. But while some indigenous people found the IWW a powerful vehicle for their organizing, the broader organization largely did not concern itself with indigenous liberation, and anarchists themselves often undertook their own colonial adventures, like the home settlement near Tacoma. Furthermore, these tenuous anti-colonial steps by wobblies and anarchists were pitted against far larger mainstream labor unions and a socialist movement that often enthusiastically upheld working-class articulations of American nationalism. The cosmopolitan, internationalist anarchists around Firebrand, the periodicals published in Home, Free Society, and later Mother Earth, frequently discussed what they called the land question, but their discourse was nearly exclusively rooted in a profoundly colonial lens that decried the monopolization of land by wealthy settlers at the expense of poorer ones. What if instead they had broached a deeper question? What is required of a truly anti-colonial revolution entirely against stolen land, against Leviathan itself? Go to the next slide. I can't claim to have a neat blueprint or all-encompassing program for a path forward. One starting point would be to simply take your own principles to heart with deadly seriousness. Stick to your guns if you proclaim to fight, as in the words of the general rules of the First International, for truth, justice, and morality without regard to color, creed, or nationality. Sometimes, like Sigismund Danielovich, you might get laughed off the stage at first. Don't give up. Go connect with others willing to fight the unpopular fight. The seeds Danielovich planted took time to grow, but after 2 decades, they blossomed into a profoundly dynamic movement that threw countless wrenches into the mechanical heart of the system. At the same time, don't assume that whatever projects you undertake start from a blank slate. Relations always exist with what comes before. If you're a white settler drawn into a land project in the woods, don't simply look at the trees and imagine untamed wilderness waiting to be molded by you and yours. Building infrastructure to take care of our needs through horizontal interdependence can't come at the expense of people who related to this land for millennia. Who around your project is struggling for land back? Is your project simply a newcomer in a long line of violent occupation? Or can you find some way to support the genuine dismantling of empire even on a small scale? And that is it.
Jesus Christ came back today like you threatened he will. Which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who I want you to ask yourself, well,